So, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many people. We have 55 on the list at the moment. There might be some more joining. And a warm welcome to Political Change in Palestine. This is the third of the Brighton Palestine Connect events. We're delighted to say that we have with us tonight Mudar Kassis and Bashir Abu Mane. I can't see him for the moment, so I'm a bit anxious. Oh, there he is. And yes, Bashir Abu Mane. And they've been asked to speak for about 15 minutes each. Unfortunately, Diana Buttu, our third speaker, became ill this morning and will not be able to speak this evening. If you're watching, Diana, then we miss you and we wish you a speedy recovery. If you have questions for the speakers, then please put them in the chat at the side and we'll deal with those when our two speakers have finished. And if you start a question with a capital Q, it makes it easier for us to find the questions in among all the other comments that anybody might make. And a quick reminder to us all to be respectful, even if we have different views. The proceedings will be recorded tonight and the recording will be made available. Let me now introduce the first speaker. Mudar Kassis has joined us just a couple of minutes ago from Ramallah. He is director of the Muatin Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. His research interests include democratization, decolonization, the concept of dignity, the everyday, human rights education, research ethics, measuring the state of democracy, political corruption, and populism. So thank you, Mudar.
Good evening, everybody. So it's a bit hard to talk about the future in Palestine where people are actually quite depressed, generally speaking. We've been especially the past few years since the Trump administration moving the embassy to Jerusalem, acknowledging settlements as legal, not that they will become legal because he said so, but all these repercussions have had repercussions that made people in Palestine think, so where do we go from here? What is it that we can do? And quite relatively recently, there has been much discussions amongst the two parts probably of people I can describe, partially amongst academics, which is not so high nor even important, but mostly about a new generation of youth. I'm talking about people who are roughly 25, so to speak, or something like that, who have been watching the dwindling of our lives over the past quarter century or less for their ages, depending on the age, of course. And they've seen that all this discussion about the peace and the state and the Oslo process and etc. is not only not leading anywhere, but actually we are worse off every day, as a matter of fact, both in terms of livelihoods, in terms of income, in terms of freedoms, including freedom of movement, of course. Freedoms of expression are also dwindling very significantly in the past period, and the small perspective that people had to resort, for example, to international law, to the UN system, to the criminal court, to the International Criminal Court, and these also seem very gloomy as perspectives. So there's been a discussion about what is it that make this situation. We've been struggling for our sort of lives for the past century, actually since the Balfour Declaration, if you wish. Things have been going without any real hope at any single point. the land has been, first divided, then stolen, then occupied, then I don't know what, um, and livelihoods are worse off. And I mean, time goes on and things are worse, and maybe we are not setting our case properly. Maybe we don't understand it the way we should, or we don't position it in the matter that we should. Now, of course, I'm not going to discuss or question at all the legitimate rights of Palestinians and the aspirations of Palestinians. These stay valid the way they are, simply because that's how they are. But the question is, how do we go about it? And the reason why I chose to focus on this today is because of the audience I understand of this with this group is it's coming from a solidarity background, and I feel we have as Palestinians a duty to tell our friends and those who are in solidarity with us. So how can we be helpful? Let's try to answer this question. And and what I would like to focus on are two things. The Palestinian sort of liberation movement has been undergoing reformations and transformations throughout its existence, but especially um, over the past half century, in particular since the mid 70s, when the slogans of the Palestinian movement have switched from liberating the people into liberating the land. That was the first kind of notion that changed slowly but surely. And then the liberation of the land has turned after the mid 70s into this idea about an independent state. And then later the state was reduced to the authority, to the Palestinian Authority. That's what Oslo was about. And then the authority became more of a municipal kind of authority, and so we are further and further on one of two tracks, either from sovereignty or from self-determination. And my point is that these are not one and the same. They are connected, of course, but they are not one and the same. And as one of my colleagues has just put it, I've been on another panel an hour ago. He said, "Are we looking for statehood or peoplehood?" This is one of the questions we need to answer. And I think the answer is obvious. Without peoplehood, there is no need for statehood or anything else. So how do we maintain our peoplehood, and how do we set our sort of aspirations in a framework that is acceptable in terms of its legitimacy, that is understandable by others, that is defensible, and that really does reflect those rights that the Palestinians wish to realize. Most interestingly, the right and the left and the liberals and the non-liberals and what have you, everybody is discussing the question of the typical question nowadays, or quite recently, about Palestine was one state or two states. And I think, as a matter of fact, this is the wrong question. The question is, what are the attributes of the freedom of Palestinians? And I think that today, in today's world, where the state has become, not only here, I mean, the state has become mostly what you can call a securitocracy. It's a system that is there to protect the security, not of the people really, but of many corporations, international bodies, the government itself, and so on and so forth. I mean, how can this setup, how can this structure that is called the state nowadays, usually embedded mostly in government, how can this fulfill the aspirations for freedom by the Palestinians? How can it protect the resources that the Palestinians need in order to survive as a people? Our water, our environment, our future, the idea of having a future, or the capacity to have a future. that's, one part of the story. The other part of the story is how do we, if we understand that the enemies of our freedom, meaning those who have the interest in this current colonial condition that Palestine is living in, are pretty much the same of those who are the enemies of the environment, of those who deny, who deny the environmental problems and the need to stop um, simply destructing um, our earth, and so on and so forth. If we have common enemies, why can't we have common struggles, agendas? Why is it that when we talk about the environment and we talk about Palestine, it's as if we are talking about really two different things? I mean, they do seem different, but if it's a general cause, then how do we frame it in a manner that gets us back together with our allies? How can the Palestinians, my third question would be, how can the Palestinians restore the place that the Palestinians, not as an ethnicity, but as a movement? How can the Palestinian liberation movement restore its position that it had in the 70s, where uh, we were sort of something that people look at to get some experience, to get some to benefit from the means and the tools and the techniques that the Palestinians were developing in their struggle, good and bad. I mean, both ways. But there was something there. Now we are basically aid recipients. We have almost nothing to offer to the people of the world. We're not offering much, and I don't think this is a proper case for people who need solidarity, because solidarity shouldn't look like charity at all. Solidarity should look like a mutual interest, and it should be based on mutual interest. It should be based on reciprocity, and so we need to frame our problems within the framework of global problems. Um, and the last thing that I want to just point to quickly is that within that framework, if our allies, the allies for our freedom project, are nations and people and not governments, pretty much. I mean, I don't deny the possibility of having allies in terms of governments, but our natural objective allies are the people. To what extent can we really resort to international law, which works only at the level of governments? Mostly, at least. I mean, human rights aside, if we take human rights a little bit outside this realm of international law, it's not exactly the right technique if we are talking about alliances with peoples. So, having said all of this, the question that we are asking here is, how do we understand and how do we present the Palestinian problem today for our allies, and what is it really that we are struggling for? And the suggestion that I would like to defend, hopefully during the question answer period, is the primacy of self-determination over everything else. If we do not focus on this right to self-determination, then whatever we achieve might go astray, just like what happened after the first Intifada. When we were about, I mean, I'm sure all of you know about the first Intifada, know about the fact that the Palestinians have managed over a roughly 5-year period to shake the grounds under the Israeli occupation, to take many things in their daily lives in their own hands. There was a price to pay, of course, a high price as a matter of fact. But then when we came to sort of cash that credit, we did not cash it into self-determination, we cashed it into a Palestinian authority under the Oslo process. And that was a huge mistake. Of course, it did not depend on us alone, but the lesson that we need to learn from there is the lesson that we should keep the question of self-determination on top of things. The second attribute for achieving the self-determination is that we should not succumb to the so-called Wilsonian formulation of self-determination. I, just briefly can say that the idea of self-determination has transformed over the time. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a very strange agreement between two people. Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin have agreed on one thing, which was the idea of the right of nations to self-determination. So self-determination became a national project rather than a project for individual freedom, which is the original liberal project, so to speak. It was reframed into another liberal project about the nation. What is missing so the first thing is that we should re-embed the individual, and not that I'm a liberal, I'm not, but we should embed the freedom of every person, every individual and group into the notion of self-determination. So self-determination cannot be equal to state sovereignty. We should ensure that this state sovereignty maintains the freedom of people, individuals and groups. And the third component that is historically not very much spoken of, although it exists naturally, is the idea of self-determination at the communal level. So communities should be able to self-determine, and any thinking about the practicality of the solution of the Palestinian problem should be thought of in terms of communities, not necessarily in terms of states. This is my thesis for a future Palestinian politics, and I would be happy to take questions and discuss further. Thank you. I think my 15 minutes are up, no?
Thank you very much, Muda. And yes, your 15 minutes, but we'll hear from you again later on with the questions. Anyway, very interesting, yes. And the Palestine question is intermingled with environmental issues. I think many people have understood that. I would now like to go to Bashir Abu Maneh, and let me introduce him. He's a reader in post-colonial literature at the University of Kent. He's author of the Palestinian novel from 1948 to the present, and has edited a collection of articles about Edward Said as theorist and public intellectual entitled After Said. He's also a regular contributor to Jacobin magazine. So Bashir, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you everyone for joining this event. I'm very happy to be here with you. I thought I'd think about what Mudar has been saying as well, and consider some of the aspects before we talk about conceptions, possibilities of change in Israel-Palestine and the occupied Palestinian territories. I thought I want to focus a little bit about impediments to change. So I want to begin by thinking about something that happened last week at the UN General Assembly Committee, which endorsed by an overwhelming majority kind of an annual resolution that affirmed, and I'm quoting, the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, including the right to their independent state of Palestine. The UN resolution also stressed, and I'm quoting again, the urgency of achieving without delay an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967, and a just and lasting and comprehensive peace settlement between Palestinian and Israeli side. 163 states voted in favor of this. These are usually the numbers that we find in the United Nations. And 5 states voted against, of course, Israel and the US, and then 3 little islands in the Pacific, Micronesia, Nauru, and the Marshall Islands. I want to begin with this essentially political fact because I think it provides a very accurate sense of what, if we want to ask, what is the international public opinion on Israel-Palestine? I think this is a testimony to that. How should we resolve the conflict? This is a key notion that we need to think about. So we find all the world, as it were, on one side, standing for peace and justice. And on the other side, we have the US and we have Israel and 3 little American client Pacific Islands. I want to look at the conflict through this, in a sense, UN prism. And I think if you look at it through this prism, the conflict is pretty simple to understand. Israel is in violation of international law. It's in violation of UN resolutions that call for the end of the occupation and for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Statehood, of course, does not address all of the aspects of the Palestinian questions, all of the injuries, but it certainly addresses a major problem that has plagued millions of Palestinians since 1967, which is the daily oppressions and humiliations of being dominated by an occupier, colonizing and expropriating your land and controlling all aspects of your life. So clear also from this is the fact that where this single UN annually renewed resolution be implemented, it would constitute a huge advance in the struggle for Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom. So the question I want to think about today is, why isn't it implemented? Why isn't this overwhelming international consensus transformed into policy? What blocks peace from becoming a reality in Israel-Palestine? I think I want to focus on three impediments today, just to help generate a discussion about those kinds of questions. And I'd like to set them out very briefly in my talk. The first, they speak, to my mind, to why the balance of power is against the Palestinians and against their struggle for justice. So the first one, of course, is Israeli state behavior and the American foreign policy support that Israel receives, protecting Israel. The second one is what you can, I think, only describe these days as a capitulationist Palestinian leadership. And the third one is the Arab dictatorships, Gulf regimes, etc. So I think for real change to occur, one or more of these obstacles either need to be diluted or they need to be overcome. So I'm going to set aside the question of the Arab regimes. We can think about it later on, if you like, their complicity with US-Israel, which is becoming more and more apparent. I'm going to focus on the first two blocks, the first two impediments to change, to transformation in Palestine, occupied Palestine, and Israel-Palestine in general. So the first one is the US and the Israel question. I think there's the expectation, if you have lived the conflict, have observed the conflict, even from outside, the expectation that Israel somehow wants peace is, I think, rather bizarre, considering the historical record. I think peace was never a priority for Israel. In fact, rejecting peace is a consistent Israeli policy, which has been articulated by many state managers. We can take an example if you like. Let's take the most prominent one, the founder of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. He articulated Israel's priorities early on very well. And I'm quoting a very good book about Israeli wars and foreign policy by Moshe Maoz called Defending the Holy Land. So let me just quote very briefly David Ben-Gurion and how he thinks about Israeli priorities. And this is him. He says, but at the same time, we have to remember that there are limits to our desire for peace with the Arabs. This is one of our vital interests, but is not the first and all-determining interest. First and foremost, he says, we have to see to Israel's needs, whether or not this brings improvement in our relations with the Arabs. The second factor is our existence. The second factor in our existence is American Jewry and its relationship with us and the state of America, since these Jews live in it, he says. And the third thing is peace with the Arabs. This is the order of priorities, and this is the end of the quote. So peace is not a priority, nor is it an independent variable here. It is actually secondary. It is a byproduct of more important interests. In fact, it is the last item on Ben-Gurion's list. The most important priority has always been for Israel. State building has always been settlements, immigration, Jewish immigration, upbuilding of the state. These are the primary needs of Jewish nationalism in Palestine. And if peace doesn't serve those core interests, then it's not to be pursued. And if it contradicts them, it's to be totally discarded. So I think you can see the problem here. So while peace is Israel's last priority, it's an existential question for Palestinians who see it as the best way of redeeming their lost lands, their lost rights. So we have two contradictory conceptions of peace at play here. Israel's sense of peace is one with colonialism, while the Palestinian sense of peace conforms to the international consensus that I've described earlier on, is peace in a sense as the end of occupation. So everything, if you think about everything Israel has done since 1993, since signing Oslo, it has done it in order to sustain its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza against the international consensus, while calling it peacemaking. You can call it whatever you want at the same time. In reality, I think Israel's sense of peace is the opposite of the international consensus. It's about intensifying colonization and settlement, not rolling back its occupation. So let's take another example of blocking this UN. You can describe it as a UN peace. Let's think about Israel's wars for a second. They too, I think, serve Israel's vital political and territorial needs. This is obvious. All the wars were avoidable wars. They were wars of choice, not wars of necessity. Give you an example. After Israel's invasion of Gaza in 2008 to 2009, Israeli historian, very prominent historian called Tom Segev, he's writing in Haaretz, and he made the following statement against the Gaza war at the time. And this is a very brief quote, very short quote from him. He says, "The justification for all the wars," he says, "and retaliatory raids, the punishments and the acts of vengeance Israel has carried out since the day it was established, derives from the claim that there was no choice," he says. "Yet time and again, it later transpired that choices did in fact exist." This is the end of quote by Tom Segev. So I think Israel opts for war, not because peaceful resolution is not possible, but because it actually rejects the international consensus and seeks to weaken Palestinians who call for it. I'll give you two examples. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon, which killed 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, was about destroying Palestinian nationalism. It was about derailing Palestinian nationalism's growing calls for peaceful settlement of the conflict. I think you can think about the invasion of Gaza 2008, 2009 in the same terms. It performed a very similar function. It tried to get Hamas off its strategic orientation towards what you can describe it as a two-state solution and undermine Palestinian democratic choice that had granted that this election victory in 2006. This was the platform that it won the elections on. Israel justifies all of its wars against essentially a defenseless Palestinian population, against defenseless civilians, as self-defense against terror. This is the language now. This is what we hear all the time on the news. I prefer to call these wars as wars of politicide. And I borrowed the term politicide from Baruch Kimmerling, who's an Israeli sociologist, political sociologist. And he uses it as a term in order to think about negating collective self-determination. I think all these wars are wars of negating Palestinian self-determination. A very good report was issued by Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq. It was a legal opinion just after the Gaza war in 2011. It issued the report. And it stated that, thinking about this question of self-defense, it stated that Israel cannot invoke the right of self-defense, which is established by Article 51 of the UN Charter, as a justification for war. There are two reasons in international relations that you can go to war. Either you have a Security Council resolution allowing it, or you invoke this Article 51 of the UN, self-defense. But Al-Haq is arguing that Israel cannot actually invoke self-defense, because it argues that any attempt to do so contravenes Israel's obligations as an occupier, its effective control, it says, of Gaza, and contravenes the legal principle, importantly, of military necessity. There is no military necessity. And it says, quote, as the exclusive legal justification for any operation. So it concludes its report saying the following: despite the widespread acceptance, this is Al-Haq, of Israel's pretext, the legal status of the occupied Palestinian territories excludes the application of Article 51 of the UN Charter as a result of prolonged occupation, end of quote. You can find this report on Al-Haq's website. So you can't break ceasefires, opt for war when a peaceful solution is possible, attack a population that you occupy, violate its right of self-determination, and call all of this self-defense. It just doesn't work in international law. So why does Israel invoke it? I think mainly to try to find justification for what it does, legal justification, or distortions of international law, excuses in international law to justify what it does. And two, importantly, to confuse public opinion, to block the international consensus that threatens its colonial priorities of territorial expansion, to reject the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. It's been nearly 20 years. And this is just a warming up of an initiative which existed in the 80s by the Arab states, which adds normalization with a whopping 22 Arab states on top of the international consensus that I mentioned earlier. So the question becomes, why can Israel get away with this? What allows it to get away with rejecting peace? And for me, there's no other way of describing this situation. Of course, the American role is key in assuring Israeli impunity. Without American diplomatic and political cover, Israel would be a pariah state. And I think it's very important to understand this. It would be boycotted, it would be isolated in global affairs until it abided by international law. The US acts as Israel's defense lawyer in negotiations. This is testimony to many negotiators who were involved in this process. It's not neutral, it's not disinterested as a participant, but it actively facilitates Israel's wishes and allows it to walk away from negotiations when it wants to, and also blame the other side for that. So the US actively protects Israel because it uses Israel in managing a region that contains, of course, the global economy's most strategic commodity, which is oil. So it does so, to my mind, for very good strategic reasons, not because American interests somehow are skewed by an Israel lobby in the US. I don't believe that. I think actually Israel does perform a role, a necessary role for America in the US. And from an American elite perspective, it's a rational investment for them to make. So $4 billion a year gives you a totally reliable ally with a population that simply loves you and accepts everything you do in the region. In fact, encourages you to do it. It's a very reliable ally, much more reliable than any of the other allies around. You can't, much more reliable than Turkey. You couldn't use Turkish bases to bomb Iraq, but you could Israeli bases. So Israel is a very reliable ally. And I think in the global scheme of things, it's a good investment for American foreign policy if you want to pursue that kind of aggressive foreign policy, to give Israel $4 billion. I'm not advocating this as a position. I'm just trying to explain that there are good strategic reasons for the US, if it pursues that kind of foreign policy, to support Israel. So Israel aids America in policing the region, in keeping nationalism at bay, in keeping radical movements at bay, in keeping independent regimes at bay. Most recent example to think about in our lifetime, as it were, is Iran. Let's not think about Nasser earlier, but Iran is a very good example of this and how the alliance actively works. So the US deploys a combination of factors, negotiations, and also threats of war, which contribute to negotiation outcomes in order to ensure US primacy in the region. Now, that, of course, is much more complicated now after America lost the Iraq war, but nonetheless, that's part of the program. And Israel is there to rely on if the option for force is necessary, as a lever of endless pressure on the Iranian regime. Israel assassinates Iranians all the time. People on Iranian territory all the time. Imagine if Iran did the same, how the world would respond, right? So I think if you follow this logic through, then it becomes clear that the Palestinians are victims of the Israeli-American alliance. There's no other way to describe it. I think what makes that possible, and I think it might be hard for the Palestinians to understand this, especially for the Palestinian elite, to internalize this. What makes it possible is that the Palestinians are geostrategically irrelevant for America. They have absolutely no strategic value for America. The US can proceed to trample on their rights and block the global consensus in order to satisfy its reliable strategic ally and make sure that Israel remains free to realize their converging interests and common objectives with America. So knowing this, and this is, maybe we should think about this more in the discussion, and I'd love to hear Mudar's views on this. I think this is hardly controversial as a description of what's happening on the ground. You might ask, why would the Palestinians have any illusions about the US as peacemakers? So let's bring me very briefly to my second impediment to change in Palestine, which is the capitulation of Fatah as a movement and the Palestinian Authority to Israeli diktat in Oslo. This is, of course, all too familiar. The PA now props up the occupation regime. There's no other way to describe it. It provides essential security services for Israel by hunting down militants and suppressing the freedoms of protest and assembly. And it blocks Palestinian reconciliation with Hamas. The list of capitulation, the list of opportunism is actually long and is quite abysmal. I'm not going to suggest incidentally that Hamas is blameless or politically faultless. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that the PA itself keeps the whole Oslo framework of subordination intact after 27 years of catastrophic results. So how long does a peace process take? It's been 27 years. You have what has been described in UN literature. I was reading the report on economic costs, which I'll quote from in a second, of the siege on Gaza the last 13 years. And it described this Oslo generation. Those born after 1993, they now account for the majority of the Palestinians. So you have a generation that knows nothing about Israel, other than closure, other than curfew, war, siege, economic suffocation, economic stagnation. Unemployment in the occupied territories is higher than elsewhere in the Arab world. In Gaza, it's 40%. Poverty levels in Gaza are over 60%. This recent UN report on the economic costs of the illegal siege of Gaza since 2007 concluded that, and I'm quoting from the report, the estimated cumulative economic costs of the Israeli occupation in Gaza under the prolonged closure and severe economic and movement restrictions, and also the cost of military operations, would amount to $16.7 billion. Somebody should compensate the Palestinians for that. This is just for the last 13 years. So the report compares it to what was before under occupation, not life without occupation. If the occupation had continued as it was, without the closure and without the wars, that's 16.7 billion. So in the occupied territories, we're talking about a society that is being degraded and that is being de-developed by military occupation every day. The Oslo regime constitutes a serious internal block on Palestinian change. Most worryingly, the election of Biden promises a return to the same mode of useless negotiations. That is, the ones that sideline rather than uphold the international consensus, and the ones that block the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. So one question to think about before I end is, why does the Palestinian elite abide by this framework? It's a catastrophic framework for its people. I think the simple answer is self-interest. The simple answer is that the Palestinian elite has internalized the defeat. The peace process allows the Palestinian elite to accrue benefits, keep international aid flowing, act as intermediaries and subcontractors to the Israeli occupation, and live better than the population that they govern. It's nothing to sneeze about. So it's safe to conclude from this that the PA will not, in and of itself, end this situation. It has too many vested interests. But two things might change this situation. One is Israeli annexation, which would undercut the Oslo elite and force a diplomatic intervention in the form of sanctions or boycott. This is a good response to the annexation. I'm not sure that we will get that response, but under international law, this is what should happen. The other one is popular Palestinian intervention. So at the moment, the first option of the Israeli elite through its appetite for more and more territory and ratification causing a real problem, the first option is more likely than the second option. Oslo has sadly been responsible for actively demobilizing the Palestinian popular resistance and facilitating a situation of permanent occupation. I don't want to end on this note, very somber note, but I think the reality of the last 3 decades is very bleak. There is, of course, much that people in the West can do in order to help Palestinians to achieve their freedom. And maybe we can just think about those questions also in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bashir. And you've actually effectively in your talk, you've managed to answer the first question and part of another one, because the first question was, when was the Palestinian issue last brought to the United Nations? Well, as we know, it was a few days ago. And as you say, 163 voted in favor of Palestinian statehood and only 5 against. And Maya Chatterjee continues, has pressure been brought to bear on various nations to side with Israel? Well, it was only the five against, which is United States, Israel, and as you say, the five islands, Marshall Islands and Niue, and so on. So I wonder whether we might broaden that out and say, has pressure been brought to bear on various nations to side with Israel in terms of other things, like possibly the accord with Saudi Arabia? I don't know if you want to address that, and then we'll go to Muda.
Yeah, I think so. It depends how you read these accords with the Gulf statelets, who were never officially at war with Israel. So what is the peace with Israel, with countries that you have been complicit with and had relations with for a very long time? So now it's more formalized. Of course, I'm not denying that this is a bad thing for Palestinians. It shouldn't be formalized. The Arabs themselves and the Arab states should abide by their own resolutions, by their own Arab peace plan. The Arab peace plan is very clear that Israel needs to withdraw, allow for a Palestinian state to exist, allow for Palestinian self-determination, and then you get the prize of being integrated into the region. You don't get that prize before you pay the costs, right? But the Arab regimes, for their own political considerations, mainly, I think, pressure from Trump, for Trump to achieve some kind of foreign affairs win, and before the elections, that was a key political issue. The second issue is this question of fighting Iran. And the Gulf states with Israel are objectively aligned, if not now subjectively aligned, to fight what they see as this the increasing Iranian presence in the region, which has taken place directly as a result of American foreign affairs and the catastrophic war in Iraq. The main winner of the war in Iraq has not been the Iraqi people, it has been Iran, thanks to America. So America is trying to push back against its own catastrophic policies in the region. And that's part of that, organizing the Arab Gulf regimes into that alliance, actively seeking peace with Israel is part of that. My sense is that this will now slow down. I don't expect, it's hard to tell these things, It's hard to expect what MBS, the head of Saudi Arabia, does, But I don't expect this after the Trump's defeat in the election for this to proceed as was planned before. So I think it'll slow down, if not stop for a while.
Muda, would you like to say a word about this?
Yeah. Well, I suspect, if to the question about whether there is some effort to put pressure on nations to side with Israel, I think we have a very, very clear and quite frightening to my sense observation, which is Sudan. Sudan was pushed into normalization with Israel by force under the threat of staying on the terrorist list, etc., etc. I don't find, for example, the Emirates signing some sort of agreement with Israel, whether they call it a peace accord or otherwise, but they have announced its reality. It's not a secret. It's a security alliance, yeah. And this is not a secret. It's it's their own wording. That's what the Emir of the United Arab Emirates said, bin Zayed. That's what he declared. It's a security alliance, and the anti-revolutionary push that is happening in Sudan now. A nation that has managed to get rid of a dirty dictator is not allowed to self-determine. It has to align with Israel in order to get some food, or in order to get its own money from the banks, or in order to build some sort of economy, and so on and so forth. This is what is happening nowadays. The clash with Iran, the seemingly clash sometimes off and on with Turkey, and etc. These are all, to me, they are. I have a friend who calls them mini empires. Mini imperialist kind of new endeavors to redivide the world in a certain way, and everybody wants to get a chunk. These are not exactly our allies, not Iran, not Turkey, not this nor that. And this is what gets me back to what Bashir was saying. I don't think it's. I don't think it's hard to swallow. Maybe it was hard to swallow, but the Palestinians have very well understood that they do not have a strategic standing on the international arena currently, and actually since roughly since 10 years at least. But it's the question really is, and what I was trying to talk about is whether this is the right arena for analysis. The one you are talking about that is led by the US. And yes, it is. It is a power. This is the Tel Aviv. This is the realities. This is the realpolitik of the world that we live in. But there's another arena, which is the popular arena, and I think that's the only arena where we can make some success, and that's why we should exert our efforts into the place where it is productive. Why invest in the US, whether you're a Palestinian elite or not? It doesn't matter. If the problem is global, and this is a major thing that I think we really need to stress, if the problem is global, it's a colonial problem. It's a colonial problem that is part of the new colonial system that is led by the United States, where there is major complicity in most of Western Europe towards it, and this complicity has moved now across the borders to across the old borders to Russia, and so on and so forth. If the threat is global, then the struggle cannot succeed if it's only local. If we keep framing the Palestinian struggle as within Palestine and then within the West Bank and probably Gaza and so on and so forth, I don't think there's a chance to fight a global battle in so much localized areas. So, and that's why I think that the Palestinian problem should be reframed as one sort of expression of a global problem. It is an extreme expression, by the way, and it is easy to present it as such because it is quite extreme. It's layers of, coloniality, neo-coloniality, occupation, a neoliberal Palestinian Authority. Why do they side with the US? Because they have interests. It's not that they are stupid. It's not that they just don't see people in the. I mean, there are smart people in the Palestinian Authority. They're just like us, and they can see. They see even broader. They know more secrets than we do, and they sideline with their interests. Of course, their major interest is to stay within the benefits package, which is quite miserable, by the way. But the benefits package that they have, they want to maintain it, and I think this is natural. So there's an alliance there. The question is, where are our alliances? And so we need, I think, to reframe the thing. The other thing, Bashir, that I really would like to note for myself and everyone else, is that we shouldn't keep thinking of Oslo as a starting point of anything. Oslo is a resultant of something that happened before it. We should keep asking, so how come did we get to Oslo? What was the mistake that we've done that got us to Oslo? Oslo is a result of something, and it's a repercussion, and we should analyze it very properly. Oslo is dead, by the way. There's no need to discuss it anymore. It is dead naturally, objectively. They can talk, as much as they want. They can fake the idea of going on with these quote unquote peace negotiations and what have you. They are not peace negotiations. The Palestinian Authority is not even in a position to surrender. I mean, if Abu Mazen comes and says, as he said at one point, I'm going to turn in the keys, I don't think he has them in order to turn them in to the Israelis or what have you. We really need to try to reframe the problem in an internationalist framework. I don't think it can be resolved as a problem of the Palestinian nationalism versus Jewish nationalism or the like. This is not a formula that shows the kind of atrocities and the history and the context of the Palestinian situation. It is, as you said, if not for the US, Israel wouldn't have managed to do all what it's doing. So it's not about Israel alone at all. And so, and hence that's how we should take it. That's how we should approach it. And again, I don't mind, playing the roles that we need to play at the UN and other international institutions. but I don't think this is enough at all. It has to be people pressing their governments to boycott Israel, people making, so in the US, they should have a few criteria. One has to do with the social security or the health system. The other might have to do with abortion, as usually the US discussion in elections. But one third thing is, are we supporting war crimes? This kind of question should come to ground. And I think that's how we should, find our sort of niche where our struggle can get more impact, so to speak.
Thank you, Mudar. Let me just say we will continue to take questions from the chat, but you could also use the raised hand facility on Zoom, which you'll find in the 3 dots where it says more. And sometimes you find it at the end of the list of participants, but I don't see that here. Anyway, the raised hand, if you want to ask questions, or use the chat. But just now, I would like to introduce Ben, who is the secretary of the Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Some questions have come in advance to him. So Ben, if you would like to put the first question.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thanks, Patricia. We have had quite a few questions in the chat, and I suppose you'll call on me from time to time to throw them in. One follows directly on what Bashir and Mudar have just been talking about, and that is about US, whether there is any reason to be hopeful about the US position, and mainly the outcome of what you have both said is the answer is no. But one of the questioners is asking not about Biden, because I mean, we all know that Biden is no friend of the Palestinians. But there is a question about the Democratic Party in the US and indications that certainly on the question of Palestine, Biden is out of step with what seems to be emerging as a majority position within grassroots democratic politics. And I just wonder, just on behalf of Colin, who's asking the question, if the panelists see that as any kind of hopeful sign, not necessarily in the next few years, but as a trend in US grassroots politics.
Mudar, you want to take that?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, so Biden is the return of the establishment, so to speak. I think the great success of Biden is sidelining Bernie Sanders. That's his, that's his success. It's not that he defeated Trump. I think the main issue for the establishment was to defeat Bernie Sanders, or the growing progressiveness that has been expressed within the amongst the American people and even within the Democratic Party. This is new. This is new. Relatively, I mean, well, we've had something similar during the Vietnam War or something in the US, but it's been a while since we haven't seen a progressive drive within the within the United States in general. And I think that we should, instead of looking at the results of the elections, we should look at its dynamics. So how much power was put to get Biden back to the threshold in order to be able to basically defeat Bernie Sanders in the primaries. Now, let me put the other side of the story. The other side of the story is, I've been a couple, 3 months ago, I was talking to my students, and I heard this version. In Palestine, this is quite typical. They think that Corbyn was taken down from the Labour Party, from the leadership of the Labour Party, because of his pro-Palestinian stance. And I said, no, it's because of his because of his progressive stances in England. It's not about Palestine really. And I think this is where the thing lies. those who support Sanders and those who support Corbyn and those who are going into the democratic movements in Europe more and more, and those who are, I mean, the growing, so to speak, the end of the depoliticization, the post-political situation of Europe, where there is no right and left and the third way, and this whole idea of, you know, you don't have to be, you forget about class analysis, you forget about this, that, and the other, and, you know, let's just try to live and make a little more income and so on and so forth. This is ending. This is ending, and I think this is where our niche lies. We will find ourselves, I'm looking at the chat, and Catherine Shea is saying, I really like the term securitocracy as it appears to define what happened in the UK, US, and other neoliberal governments, which there is something that we share. It's not in Palestine alone. People are repressed not only under occupation. People are oppressed through various trends and means, and I think there is a way to unite. Whether we can count on Biden, the answer is no. Whether we can count on the growth of anger within the Americans, I think yes. What the changes that are taking place in the politics of Europe altogether are important. The imposition or the weakness of the United States and the natural imposition of a multipolar world rather than a unipolar and a bipolar is also very important for all of us, and we should capitalize on these phenomena, and we should notice them. The one problem that we are having is especially in the Arab world, in Palestine in particular, is the weakness of political organization. There are no political parties. I mean, there are facades of them, but there is no political movement. Youth are not getting organized. I'm not sure how the situation is currently in Europe, but in the last while it was pretty much the same. People became a bit apolitical, and this is where the problem lies. It's not about those who get to office. I mean, money will get people into office. The question is, what are the things that we cannot do, that are not done by money, but are done through other means, through our sort of daily work on the streets, through our vigils, through our protests, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think there is room for grassroots movements in the US and beyond, and I think that the current pandemic will also make this whole problem much more acute, and I think that there is room for the future. You know, I've been reading a few months ago, David Harvey wrote a very interesting article right after the pandemic started, and so he said the world cannot stay the way it is right now. Capitalism is too big to defeat right now, but the future will have some socialist component. I'm not quoting. I'm just hopefully getting his idea through quickly. So there's something socialist in the new system, in the emerging system that we are going to. The question really is whether it's people's socialism or national socialism. If it's nationalist socialism, and I think the world is moving, there is a fascist threat that we are facing, and the battle against fascism is a broad battle where I think that people will be united just the way they were roughly during the Second World War, if you want. I find many comparisons between right now and the pre-World War and the during World War II era, and maybe we should make the necessary comparisons and not try to go back to the past, but try to build the future, bearing in mind those possibilities that were there.
Shia, do you want to have another go at this question? You did.
Yeah.
You spoke about this in your presentation, that you weren't hoping for anything much better from Biden.
No, I don't think the Biden scenario. I mean, you know, if I were asked to vote between Trump and Biden, of course I'd vote for Biden. There's no question about it, for various things. Progressive pressure from the Democratic Party in order to affect a Biden presidency, not having a white nationalist in place, you know, that are not unleashing the Israeli right wing the way that Trump did without unhinging it, etc. So absolutely, there are differences. But for the Palestinians, Biden comes with this reheating the same ideas that have been failing for the last 30 years in Palestine. So he himself does not present an alternative, nor does it seem that his administration presents a real alternative in the sense of coming closer to the international consensus. So I think on that we can agree. Why invest in the US? I think because the US is the most important country in the world. I don't see any, it's not because one wants to, it's because where power lies, and the fight in the US is worth having. So I think progressives recognize that in the US. People in the grassroots of the Democratic Party recognize that. The Bernie movement recognizes that there is an alternative conception to the US over health service, over education, over curtailing the power of companies in people's lives. And that also includes over militarism and aggressive foreign policies and wars. So yes, absolutely, this all goes together. And the Palestinian cause has always been at its best entangled with the most progressive political movements around the world. And that should continue. That was precisely what I'm trying to suggest in my talk, that we have this incredible asset as a people of a popular international public opinion that supports the Palestinian cause, and more so. And more and more so, I'll give you an example, in the Jewish community in the US, the new generation simply either doesn't think about Israel, or Israel clashes with its liberal assumptions and liberal worldview, or is totally indifferent to what Israel is doing, or is supportive of the Palestinians. So Israel actually, if you think about what Israeli state managers are thinking about all the time, is in a panic over the popular support that Israel receives in America. The Zionist cause is no longer a popular cause in the US like it was before. People don't have illusions about Israel like they had before. And this is an asset for the Palestinian struggle. So the movement that's coming through the Democratic Party, and all power to it, the Bernie movement, which talked about implementing a foreign policy that has human rights at its core, that would condition support for Israel. That's a small thing for Palestinians to think about, but in the American context, to condition support for Israel on Israeli behavior over wars, etc., is a big thing, and that's a very positive development. How I think you can affect that change in the US is not through the corridors of the White House in any way, but I agree with Mudar there, that it is through popular pressure from below, that the movement needs to be able to hold the administration accountable. So the same in Britain, right? If Britain now is, and the British Progressive Party has been taken over now by reheated Blairites, one of the things to do is to continue organizing on the ground and to push the political spectrum to the left. So, and that happens not in the corridors of power, it happens outside on the street and connected up to, of course, all the other causes, progressive causes that progressives worry about. Education, health, the environment, general progressive socialist positions, etc. So yes, the Bernie moment is a very significant moment, and it shows us that there are real contradictions in American policy, which if I were Palestinian, one should keep a very close eye on and worry about and try to support, absolutely. Merely from a pragmatic perspective that the US, again, is the most powerful state in the world. And what the US does is consequential, more than any other state. So yes, that's why I would invest in the US. There's a slight difference between me and Mudar. I understand his way of trying to expand the Palestinian question and take on board progressive movements around the world. Of course, we are totally in agreement on this. But I think one of the great assets of the Palestinian question is international law. And one of those assets is to say that the Palestinians, whether we believe in continuing to fight for it or not, deserve a state of their own. I don't see why one should say, no, I want something bigger, or I want to go beyond states. No, I want the state. Thank you very much. Give me the state, and then I can do with it whatever I want to do with it. But I have a right to that state. And I think that's regardless of whether the PA believes it, that's irrelevant to me. The two political movements in the US, in Palestine, the major political movements, also inside Israel as well, all believe that a Palestinian state is a legitimate Palestinian right, and it's enshrined by international law, and the Palestinians deserve it. states are the biggest things around. There are 120 of them for good reason, right? I don't think the Palestinians should say, we are above states. No, no, we should take the state and then be above it. That's fine. Be in solidarity, have commonalities, develop other forms of struggle. That's fine. But when you have millions of people suffering on a daily basis because they don't have a state, I don't think we can afford to say we need to do bigger things. No, I want the thing that would be able to protect me from what Israel is doing on a daily basis. And that's what statehood is. It allows you sovereignty, and it allows you certain freedoms, and it allows you rights in the international community, which is why Israel has been fighting it for so long, and which is why Israel has rejected it. Had it been an irrelevance or not so important, Israel wouldn't have cared about it. So I would go for it.
Just following up on this question of international law, Bashir, what hope do you have for the ICC, the International Criminal Court?
So again, I think that Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza, and they should be prosecuted for it. Absolutely, prosecuted for those war crimes. So I think, yes, it is an available venue. And, you know, here's one of the peculiarities about the Palestinian question and about the PLO. The PLO has embassies in all around the world. It has embassies, it has ambassadors, it is treated like a state. There is something called the State of Palestine, which exists in virtual reality, but it has all those embassies. What you have to ask yourself, for a political movement that has been around for the last 50 years, what do those embassies do? What do they do? They are certainly not calling for BDS. They are certainly not calling for the boycott of Israel. They're certainly not calling for Israel to be held for its war crimes, held accountable for its war crimes. So I think absolutely they should do this. It is totally legitimate. And Israelis who participated in war crimes should be worried about traveling to Europe. Absolutely. That is elementary. Why shouldn't they be? They committed the war crimes. So yes, go to the ICC, and if you can get a win from the ICC, get a win from the ICC. It is, politics is about arenas where you can fight and present your case. This is an available arena for the Palestinians, and it so happens, importantly, that international law is on Palestinian side, because the Palestinian side is oppressed and the Palestinian side is weak, and Israel is violating their rights. So why wouldn't one go there? I don't understand the argument of not going.
Mudar, do you have a view on going to the ICC, or what hope you can expect from the International Criminal Court?
I think we should use all available tools. I would like to have a take on what Bashir was just saying. What you were saying, Bashir, I think is absolutely valid when it comes to the text of international law. You're absolutely right. We have our rights all in the text and in all resolutions. But then international law is a tool, actually. And you can use tools in different ways. Let me just remind you the one thing that the resolution that you were just quoting when you started speaking about the inalienable rights of the Palestinians to self-determination, etc. It's been sort of reissued this thing resolution for for some 40 years, I think now, or something like that. And the text is the same, but the reality is really different. I mean, look at, if you remember that UN session, it really drew my attention, and I think if anybody of you have observed what has happened there, when Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem, there was a UN session, and there were many speeches about that. What I found very interesting at that point is that every single speaker from the, classical allies of the Palestinians, like what have you, Pakistan, China, Russia, Venezuela, what have you, all of them have made a very interesting statement towards the end of the statement that they look for a negotiated solution for the problem. So the right of Palestinians for self-determination is not really self-determination. Now it's conditioned on, in the framework of international law, it suddenly became conditioned on an agreed upon kind of self-determination. We have to get Israel's approval of our own self-determination. And this is not the text of international law, but that's how it's operating right now. If you look at a year ago or so, I was in South Africa. There was a discussion amongst South Africans about the about the withdrawal of African countries from the ICC because of the fact that it is targeting only Africans and it's not, for example, targeting Israel almost at all, etc. And there was a discussion about how useful is it to get out, and the guy was telling me from South African Foreign Affairs. So, I mean, I don't see why are we holding this position where we cannot sit there and support you guys in the ICC. Why is it that we need to withdraw? This is not what we need, and so on and so forth. And maybe he's right. I'm not going into technicalities here, but international law is a very good potential. But in order to utilize it, there are conditions. And these conditions do not rely upon neither the American administration, nor the British government, nor the Palestinian Authority, nor Israel or the like. It's a balance of powers. And the way where we can tip the balance of powers towards our righteous goals, like freedom and self-determination and the like, whether in the form of state or not. I mean, I don't mind having a state, by the way, Bashir, but it's not my goal. That's what I'm trying to say, right? I mean, I'm not fighting for a state. I'm not fighting to get, you know, arrested by the Palestinian security rather than the Israeli. It doesn't matter much. What counts really is whether we have the sufficient power to utilize this instrument that is called international law. We cannot just keep resorting to it, empowering it if it's working against us. It's, you know, you hold the gun, you need to have a good aim, and you have the good, you know, ammunition and capacity to use this tool properly.
Thank you. Muda, here's a question from Agnes. Does political allegiance reflect social class? Which party attracts younger Palestinians?
I read the question, and I have to confess, I didn't know how to pronounce Agnes, so I stayed silent. So thanks for doing that. So it's a long story. Palestinian youth are currently much less than before, significantly less than before, affiliated to any parties altogether. Now they try to do their own kind of movement, the smaller groups. They're pretty much, many of them less politicized, etc. And even those who are highly politicized find that the Palestinian political parties are very corrupt and they don't want to align with them. Not Fatah, not Hamas, not the PFLP, not this, that, or the other, etc. Of course, I mean, I'm talking generally speaking, not that there isn't at all anybody, but the idea is of two things. First is this notion of post-politics. Because the parties do not anymore represent left and right, because they do not have a class standing, because of this whole idea of Palestinians trying to be Palestinian without differentiating between capitalist Palestinian, labor Palestinian, peasant Palestinian, poor Palestinian, wealthy Palestinian. This kind of amalgam of Palestinians is not susceptible and not helpful for people to get into parties. But if the slogans are all the same, if everybody claims that they want a state on the 1967 borders, including East Jerusalem, etc., how do I choose my party? How do I choose where to go if they basically all have more or less the same program, and actually nobody is really working on it, I mean, towards its achieving. So one of the things that we really need here is to get back to a situation where I can find real differences between parties. And the differences in the case of Palestine have to be much better nuanced, because it is true that mostly all the Palestinians have a common interest in ending the occupation, a very simple one. And it is our first priority. So the differences between parties would be sort of in the techniques we use, in the tools we use, not in the bigger strategy. That's one. And two, they should become much more socially nuanced, like who is progressive socially, who is for women's rights, who is for real equality, who is for, I mean, if the main question, once the main question is about we are all against Israel, then differentiation is very hard. And there's no need to go to this or that party. There's no need to really pick and choose. The Palestinian problem being framed as a national problem and not as a class problem has made it almost impossible to find the differences between parties. And I think we need help and support to understand our own problem as a class problem, as a class struggle. And otherwise, I don't think we can, we can form a strong alliance if we are allied with our objective enemies, so to speak. Because there are Palestinians who have vested interest in the occupation. You can imagine those who are benefiting from VIPs or have monopolies on import, or those whose products, I mean, even look at I don't want to take much time, but look at the BDS itself. I mean, do you know how the BDS operates here inside the West Bank, for example? I mean, what it works is the following: a Palestinian capitalist who owns a yogurt factory or a milk factory or something can easily sell their products under the BDS campaign, even if it's not of a quality that as good as the Israelis, and for the same price. That's what you will find in the Ramallah supermarket. Why is it? Because they are cashing our resistance already. I mean, they're not even waiting for the liberation. They're benefiting from it. So our alliances have to be made a little more clearer. I mean, of course, we do have a common goal, but the way we want to achieve this goal is not exactly the same, and this is not getting reflected, or because of this vagueness of the nuanced differences between different political ideologies that are almost kept aside and shelved in a way, and we don't really discuss them because of the main question. It is very hard to get youth nowadays into parties. This started right either with the Oslo process, if you wish, or with the emergence of the Palestinian Authority, but actually it started when parties became not so popular all over the world. It started after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the world became unipolar, after the paradigm of the third way has emerged with Giddens, after the Labour Party in Britain became mainstream liberal and stopped being a progressive party. It happened when the PLO has stopped being a revolutionary movement but became a thrust for power, and so on and so forth. I mean, many things happened over the past 3 decades that lead to one conclusion: we cannot operate properly towards freedom if we accept the current setup. The system that we live in is not susceptible for any kind of freedom, neither national liberation nor any other freedom for that matter. Even our privacy is now completely non-existent.
Could I ask Bashir to take this forward by way of answering another question which we had from Debbie and Martin Smith? The question is there a Palestinian politician who might lead a political movement to challenge the PA and impress international opinion with his or her vision?
So I think the problem is that it's not actually about an individual in this case. I think part of the problem of not having powerful progressive politics in the West Bank and Gaza are to a large extent a result of the change in Israeli policy in relationship to the labor market. So what Oslo brought about, and I think this is the social basis of the transformation that we need to think about when we think about political parties. What Oslo brought about is the closure and the exclusion of Palestinian labor from the Israeli market. Palestinian labor was much more powerful before. And when it was much more powerful, it produced, Mudar alluded to this when he was talking, it produced something as great and magnificent as the First Intifada, which was a self-organized, massive social intervention into the occupation against Israel's occupation, etc. But it could do that exactly because it had a position of leverage within the Israeli economy. What Oslo brought about is the exclusion of that. It excluded Palestinian labor from that. So it brought about a totally different settled colonial regime that has excluded labor and made labor much more vulnerable and insecure. So Israel's relationship to Palestinian labor now is like a faucet. It opens it and it closes it whenever it wants. It issues permits, it takes away permits. Palestinian labor, if it resists, if a member of the family resists, then the permit is taken away. So they're constantly worried about resisting Israel, because then the Shabak would find out, and then they would take away your permit to work in Israel. So that automatic thing that you had before closure, 91, 93, etc., has now gone. And I think if we think about progressive politics as emanating from a labor base, that labor base now is much more fragmented, it's much more marginalized, and it's much more precarious as a result of what the new Oslo labor regime. So that's one element of this. The other element, of course, is that the PLO itself failed to realize the aspirations of secular Palestinian nationalism. So then the alternative, like everywhere in the Arab world, proposed itself, which is the Islamic movement, which happened at exactly the same time as that failure was taking place. Initially early on in the first Intifada, but then becoming much more powerful later on and winning the election, because the PLO itself failed to produce the goods. And then the Islamic movements came with a terrible social agenda of oppressing women, veiling women, etc., much more controlled authoritarian conceptions of how society should look like and should behave, offered the occupied a vision of liberation through armed struggle, etc., through military resistance, etc. For a desperate a population that had no other options, this had its attractions, of course, totally understandable. But this happened across the Arab world. I think now we have something, possibly the opportunity for something else to take place. But it didn't. It's much more complicated. When the Arab world was undergoing the Arab Spring and people were mobilizing for their democratic rights, the effects on Palestine were minimal. Because the regime is much harsher over those questions. So I think it's a complicated issue. And I think it's deeply connected to the regime that we have in place, the market regime, Israel's relationship to the labor market and the way it fragmented it. I wanted to agree with Mudar, lest he thinks I'm somehow disagreeing with him about any of those questions that he's raising, over the question of self-determination. And I think this was an issue that was asked in one of the questions, the issue that I was very happy the way he resolved the question of one state or two state. I really don't think that's an important discussion for a solidarity movement to have, in a sense. The only thing that the solidarity movement should advocate is the Palestinian right of self-determination. How the Palestinians decide to realize that right institutionally is not something which should worry the movement outside. So I think the core value is Palestinian self-determination, and Palestinian self-determination not only under occupation, but for all Palestinians everywhere, including Palestinians inside Israel, and including Palestinians in the diaspora, including refugees. That is my understanding of self-determination, and that takes away the focus of having the PLO, which is a dead shell of an organization, speak on behalf of the Palestinians. I think the Palestinians, of creating that sense of a collective organization which tries to facilitate self-determination across wherever Palestinians happen to be in a unified organization, I think that's a powerful way of thinking about the problem. And any solution that the Israelis might want to offer down the line, if they seek to have peace in the region, we might have another 100 years of war. Who knows? Right?
Thank you, Bashir. I'm just looking at the time. I just wanted to mention to you that Catherine Shea has said, I wonder how many nations really have self-determination as peoples. This is obviously harking back to your mention of peoplehood. We don't really have time to go into that, but it's a question to be thinking about. I'd like to go to Barry Ben, who is doing the, who would like to have a word about the local Brighton and Hove Palestine Solidarity Campaign. and then we'll come back and finish the meeting.
Okay, thanks. Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Patricia. And I mean, we will thank Muda and Bashir properly in a minute, but I've just been so stimulated and my mind is in overload trying to deal with so many interesting and often very depressing ideas. So many thanks to you both from me. Just a quick announcement as far as local solidarity activities are concerned. And it's just to remind people, or to tell them if they're not already aware, that this weekend, the 28th and 29th of November, is part of a National Week of Action called by National Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And in particular, Saturday, the 28th, is a national day of action. Of course, we had hoped when it was first announced that our contribution to that would be a display of solidarity on the streets of Brighton. Under lockdown, that's not possible, but there are still a lot of things that people can do from home. And I would strongly encourage everyone to go onto the national PSC website. That's palestinecampaign.org. There are full details there of the day of action on Saturday. And on Sunday, the 29th, there's an international solidarity rally starting at 5 p.m. UK time with an international lineup of speakers, really interesting. And that's another way, of course, of expressing your solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. I don't know how those expressions of international solidarity fit in with the pictures that have been painted by our speakers, but I'll leave that to everyone else to decide. But please contribute if you can to those two events at the weekend. Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody for coming this evening to this meeting, and especially thank you so much to Bashir Abumane and to Muda Kassis for such an interesting presentation and for taking our questions. It seems to me the hope lies in the young, as you were saying, that the young people, the young Jews in America and so on, are not that concerned about Israel. Perhaps they're more concerned about internationalism. And let's hope also that maybe the ICC comes up with some kind of solution. I don't mean solution, but some forward movement, because they are thinking about it, aren't they? Anyway, let's hope we meet again at some stage, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.